Tonight, we follow the story of a player who did everything and yet was never spoken about the same way as the others. There is a moment, and if you have seen it, you already know exactly what is coming, where a footballer does something that does not feel like it belongs in a real game. Not because it is acrobatic, not because it is violent or reckless, but because it arrives at the exact right second, in the exact right shape, with a kind of calm precision that should not be possible under the weight of what is at stake. A Champions League place, a season teetering on the edge, tens of thousands of people in a stadium who already believe it is over. And then, in the final seconds, the ball loops through the dark air toward a man who has already scored twice that night, and instead of controlling it, instead of placing it carefully, he simply throws his body sideways into a bicycle kick, and it goes in. It goes in cleanly. It goes in as though the goal had simply agreed to receive it. That man was Rivaldo. And yet, when people list the greatest footballers of the late 1990s and early 2000s, his name arrives a little later than it should. It comes after other names, after louder personalities, after players who, perhaps, understood how to tend their own legend with more deliberate care. Rivaldo, Vitor Borba Ferreira, born in Recife in northeastern Brazil, World Cup winner, Ballon d'Or holder, and the author of one of the most extraordinary individual performances in the history of European club football, is somehow not quite the first name you reach for. That gap is what we are here to explore tonight. Not to argue, not to rank, but simply to sit with the question of why a player of this stature exists slightly to the side of the conversation, and to let the answer reveal itself slowly, the way answers tend to when you take enough time to look. There is a particular kind of greatness that does not announce itself. It does not arrive with a biography that reads cleanly from one end to the other. It does not come with a personality that makes itself easy to summarize, easy to package, easy to sell. Rivaldo's greatness was of that kind. It was concentrated, intermittent. And when it arrived completely, without warning and without preamble. He could disappear from a match for stretches that would make you question your own earlier assessment of him. And then, in a single movement, from a single touch, in the space of a single second, he would decide everything. That quality is almost impossible to build a legend around. Legends require continuity. They require a thread the audience can follow across time, a narrative that accumulates weight. Rivaldo's thread went underground for long passages, and then erupted. The moments were complete. The tissue between them was often invisible. And football memory, like all memory, is built as much from texture and continuity as from individual events. To understand why he was the way he was, it helps to understand where he came from, not in the way a biography begins at the beginning, but in the way a person's instincts reveal their origin. Rivaldo grew up in Paulista, a small city in the state of Pernambuco in northeastern Brazil. Pernambuco is not Rio de Janeiro. It is not São Paulo. It does not carry the same cultural weight in the global imagination of Brazil, and it did not, in the years when Rivaldo was growing up, offer the kind of football infrastructure that existed in the wealthier regions of the country. His childhood was not comfortable. His father, Romildo, died when Rivaldo was young, and the family had very little to fall back on. The household was precarious in a way that shapes a person at a level below conscious thought. Football, for him, was not a leisure activity. It was not a performance. Or it was the thing available to him, and he pursued it with a directness that grew not from ambition in the public sense, but from something more fundamental. He needed it to work. He needed it in the way that is different from wanting it. And that distinction between need and want produced a relationship with the ball, with the act of playing, that never quite acquired the social dimension that the game carries for players raised in different circumstances. Players who grow up surrounded by coaching academies, by proper nutrition and equipment, by professional feedback from the age of 7, they develop a relationship with football that includes performance as part of its core structure. There is an audience from the beginning. There is praise, visibility, the constant presence of others evaluating what they are doing. The football becomes partly a social act, partly a communication with the world around them. For Rivaldo, the formation was quieter. What he developed was a relationship with the ball itself, a private understanding of what it could do and what he could make it do. The technical vocabulary he built came from hours of repetition that had nothing to do with how it looked and everything to do with whether it worked. This is not a romantic reading of poverty producing greatness. That narrative is too simple and too often used in ways that are not honest. What it is, instead, is an observation about how the specific conditions of his formation shaped his relationship with football into something less public, less performative, and more internally organized than the relationships of players whose development occurred in more visible environments. The consequence was a player who never seemed to be playing for the appreciation of others, who never seemed to need the confirmation of applause, who, in the middle of a match at the Camp Nou with 80,000 people watching, could look entirely self-contained. There is a specific kind of player that football fans describe, sometimes without realizing they are describing something rare, as a player who makes the game look slow. Not slow in the sense of lethargic or cautious or lacking urgency. Slow in the sense that when the ball reaches them, time appears to reorganize itself around the moment. Decisions that should require fractions of a second seem, from the outside, to have been made before the ball even arrived. The body is already turning. The weight is already shifting. The foot is already positioned. The rest of the game catches up afterward. Rivaldo was that kind of player. And it is worth spending time with this quality because it explains something about why watching him was both thrilling and, in a strange way, almost peaceful. He did not produce the sensation of chaos under control, which is what many exciting players give you, the feeling that they are operating at the very edge of what is manageable, that the skill and the danger exist in the same narrow space. He produced something different, a sense that the situation, however pressured, was already resolved, that the question had been answered before anyone else had finished reading it. This is not a quality you can train directly. You can train technique, you can train fitness, you can train positioning and movement patterns, and the mechanical habits that make certain kinds of decision faster. But the particular cognitive quality that allows a player to process a match at a speed that makes their choices look unhurried, that is something deeper and more difficult to explain. In Rivaldo's case, it almost certainly came from the thousands of hours of the kind of football he played growing up. Football in conditions where the environment was not controlled, where the surfaces were uneven, where the other players around you were not organized by age group or ability, where you had to learn to read situations that changed unpredictably because the alternative was simply not playing well enough to continue. That kind of formation produces a reading of the game that is less algorithmic and more intuitive, less based on pattern recognition from structured training, and more based on a direct, internalized understanding of space and probability. When he arrived in professional football, first at Santa Cruz in Recife, then at Mogi Mirim in São Paulo State, and then at Corinthians, where his development accelerated significantly, the coaches who worked with him encountered something that was clearly different from ordinary technical quality. He had that quality, but it was combined with this other thing, the capacity to see the game slightly ahead of where it was, to occupy positions and make movements that only made sense a few seconds later, when the situation had developed into the shape he had apparently already anticipated. At Corinthians, his performances attracted serious attention from European clubs. He moved to Deportivo de La Coruña in Spain in 1996, and then to Barcelona a year later. The Spanish football environment was in some ways the right context for him. The technical demands of La Liga rewarded the kind of close control and positional intelligence he possessed, and the pace of the game allowed his particular reading to be fully expressed. In leagues where the physical tempo is extremely high and the transitions happen at great speed, players who think slightly ahead sometimes find their advantages compressed because there is simply not enough time for the situation to develop into the shape they have read. In Spain, there was time. Not much, but enough. His debut season at Barcelona was careful rather than spectacular. He was adjusting to a new country, a new language, a new set of teammates, a new tactical framework under Van Gaal that was more rigidly organized than anything he had operated within before. There were matches in that first year where he seemed constrained, where the freedom he needed to find his best positions was not quite available to him within the system's demands. But those who watched closely could see, even in the constrained version, what was available when the system relaxed its grip. By the second season, the grip had loosened. Or perhaps more accurately, Rivaldo had found the spaces within the structure where his instincts could operate, without constant conflict with the tactical shape. Let us go to Barcelona properly now. Not to the beginning, not to those cautious early months, but to the middle of it, when what he was capable of had become something the football world was actively trying to understand in real time. Barcelona were, in the late 1990s, a club of enormous expectation and enormous internal tension. The post-Johan Cruyff era had produced changes in coaching and in identity that had not yet resolved into anything clean and settled. Van Gaal's structural thinking was pragmatic, demanding, systematic, concerned with positions and responsibilities, and the collective discipline of the pressing game. The team he built was organized around ideas that would become very influential across European football in the decade that followed. Rivaldo existed inside that structure in a way that was unusual. He was not a disciplined component of a machine. He was a presence that the system had to accommodate, not the other way around. Van Gaal, to his credit, arrived at a practical tolerance for this. Rivaldo would drift. He would find himself on the left side, then centrally, then withdrawn behind the striker, then suddenly at the edge of the area, with the ball at his feet, and a defender trying to calculate what he was about to do. The role changed from passage to passage, depending on where the space appeared and where his own reading of the situation took him. That kind of freedom is only sustainable when the player justifies it completely and consistently. Rivaldo did. What he produced in that second season was of the very highest quality the European game had to offer. Goals from the left foot from outside the penalty area that bent in trajectories suggesting a different understanding of physics. Goals inside the box where the footwork before the shot made the decision look obvious and the execution look impossible to have predicted. Assists from moments of vision where the passing option had been identified 2 moves before anyone around him had seen it. The numbers were extraordinary. His total output placed him among the very best in Europe by any reasonable measure. And Barcelona won La Liga. They won it convincingly. In 1999, the professional football writers of the world voted Rivaldo the best player on the planet, the Ballon d'Or. It is worth sitting with that for a moment. The late 1990s were not a thin period in the history of the game. Zinedine Zidane was active. Ronaldo, the Brazilian striker, the first Ronaldo, the original, was battling back from injuries that had repeatedly removed him from competition. Thierry Henry was ascending at Arsenal. David Beckham was at the height of his powers at Manchester United. Patrick Vieira was reshaping ideas about what a midfielder could be. Roberto Carlos was at Real Madrid, doing things with a football that seemed to belong to a different sport. The field of candidates for that award was genuinely deep, and the voters chose Rivaldo. He was, in that specific moment, the best footballer in the world, according to the people best positioned to make that judgment. This is not a piece of historical trivia. This is the record. A Ballon d'Or is not awarded casually, and the 1999 award was not a consolation prize or a default. It was a recognition of sustained matchday level excellence across a complete season. And yet, the Ballon d'Or of 1999 does not carry the same weight in conversation as some of the awards around it. The 1998 award, which went to Zidane after France won the World Cup on home soil, arrives in memory, carrying the whole weight of that summer and that triumph. The early 2000s would eventually belong, in terms of award history, to Ronaldo recovering from his injury years, and then to the emerging generation that followed. Rivaldo's award sits in a gap in the narrative, significant, real, documented, but not surrounded by the kind of story that makes a specific year feel like a specific year. He did not, after receiving it, do what might have amplified its significance. He did not build a new public presence on top of it. He did not become more vocal, more visible, more deliberate about his place in the hierarchy of the game. He accepted it, spoke about it in the measured way he spoke about most things, and returned to playing football. For some players, the Ballon d'Or is the organizing event of an entire career identity. It becomes the title that precedes everything else. Former Ballon d'Or winner, the greatest player in the world, the moment when the world recognized what you already knew about yourself. For Rivaldo, it was a point on a line that continued in both directions, without being made into a centerpiece of anything. There is something important in this. We live in a world where visibility and memory are closely connected, and where the players we remember most vividly across generations are often the ones who understood, at some level, how to exist within the media structures of their time, who cultivated relationships with journalists that produced stories, who had personalities that translated into quotable moments, into profile pieces, into documentaries that could be made in their honor, who were connected through personality or circumstance to narratives that had shape and arc and emotional clarity. Rivaldo sought none of that, or perhaps more accurately, it was simply not part of how he understood himself as a footballer. He was a player. The football was the communication. The consequence of that, over decades, is a kind of historical softening. The moments remain vivid for those who watch them live. But the connective tissue that transforms a career into a fully realized narrative, the anecdotes, the relationships, the behind-the-scenes details that make a footballer feel knowable beyond the 90 minutes, is thinner than it is for other players of comparable achievement. When we say we do not talk about Rivaldo enough, part of what we are actually saying is that we do not have enough of the material that sustained conversation requires. Now, the Valencia match. We have been circling it. It is time to enter it properly, because it is not simply the most famous moment in Rivaldo's career. It is a kind of compressed statement of everything he was, delivered in a sequence that could not have been written in advance. The date was June 17th, 2001. The venue was the Camp Nou in Barcelona. The match was the final group stage game in the UEFA Champions League, and for Barcelona, it was an elimination match in practical terms. They needed a positive result to secure their passage into the knockout rounds. Valencia were the opponents. Valencia at that time were not simply a capable European team. They had been Champions League finalists in 2000 and again in 2001. They had players of real quality throughout their squad and a head coach, Hector Cooper, who had built them into one of the most organised sides in European football. Coming to the Camp Nou for a match that had real consequences, they were not intimidated. The stadium was full, and it carried the specific tension of a match where the home team needs something and is aware, on some deep level, that needing is not the same as having. The Camp Nou can be buoyant, and it can be anxious. And in the opening exchanges of that night, it was something closer to anxious. The weight of necessity, producing an atmosphere that was tight and pressured rather than free. Rivaldo had not begun the match in a way that suggested what was coming. This, in retrospect, fits the pattern. He rarely announced his intentions in advance. He rarely produced the kind of extended dominant performance in the first 30 or 40 minutes that signals a player taking over a match. He existed within it. He received the ball, moved with it, lost it, received it again. He was there without yet being decisive. The goals changed that. His first goal in that match came in the second half. A composed finish from inside the penalty area after a sequence of Barcelona play that opened the space for him to arrive. It was not a spectacular goal. It was a good goal, the kind that requires excellent movement, and then a clean execution in a moment when the goalkeeper has been given no time to set. It gave Barcelona the lead and gave the atmosphere in the stadium a more settled quality. Then Valencia equalised, and the settled quality dissolved. In the final 20 minutes of that match, with the scores level, the situation had become urgent in a way that was difficult to manage. The crowd could feel the mathematics of it. The players on the pitch could feel the mathematics of it. A draw was not enough. A draw meant elimination. The match had to be won, and time was running. In approximately the 78th minute, Rivaldo received the ball at the left edge of the penalty area. He had space, briefly, because of the way the Valencia defensive shape had adjusted to the Barcelona pressure. The space was not large, and it was not going to be there for long. He opened his body, weighted his left foot, and drove a shot that went in at the near post before the goalkeeper could move effectively to it. His second goal of the match. Barcelona led again. The Camp Nou erupted with the specific quality of relief. But the match was not finished. Valencia still had time. They pressed. They moved the ball. They created moments of danger. And Barcelona had to defend, and were not entirely comfortable doing it. The stadium was loud but nervous. There were long minutes still remaining, minutes in which anything could happen, in which a moment of defensive uncertainty could bring everything back to zero. Then, in the third minute of added time, with the referee preparing to end the match, with the Camp Nou standing in anticipation of the final whistle, a corner kick came in from the left side of the pitch. Corner kicks in the closing seconds of matches are often moments of improvised chaos. The defensive shape is compressed. Players are jumping. The ball arrives at height and at speed, and the options for the attacking players are constrained by where the defenders have positioned themselves and where the ball's trajectory is going to take it. In most circumstances, the best outcome is a header on target, or a clearance that leads to another set piece, or a scramble that produces something messy but potentially dangerous. The ball came toward Rivaldo at a height that placed it behind him as he moved. It was dropping in a trajectory that made a conventional headed finish impossible. from where he was standing. To reach it in any meaningful way, he would need to turn against the direction of his own movement and make contact with the ball at a point above and behind his own body. There is one technique that accommodates that geometry. It is called a bicycle kick or an overhead kick, and it requires a player to throw both feet upwards simultaneously, make contact with the ball as the body becomes horizontal, and generate enough power and direction on the shot to actually threaten the goal rather than simply make contact. Rivaldo left the ground. His body went horizontal. He made contact with the ball at the apex of his movement, both feet connecting in a scissoring motion that sent the ball on a descending arc toward the Valencia goal. It went in. It crossed the line cleanly, inside the far post. And it went in. For a moment, a very brief moment, the stadium did not react in the way that stadiums usually react to goals. There was the fraction of a second in which 80,000 people were processing what they had just seen. Then the Camp Nou produced a sound that was not the sharp, percussive eruption of surprise, but something deeper and more sustained. The sound of a crowd recognizing that it had just witnessed something that would be shown again and again for years as an example of what football at its most complete can look like. 3 goals in a Champions League match that had to be won, each one different from the others. The first, a composed professional finish in the second half, exactly right. The second, a powerful driven shot from the edge of the area with the match level, and Barcelona needing to regain the lead. The third, a bicycle kick from a corner in the 3rd minute of added time, with qualification at stake. The thing that separates this performance from other great individual performances in the history of European football is not the bicycle kick alone. It is the accumulation. It is the fact that in a match where the pressure was genuine and the opponent was real, a player produced not one extraordinary solution, but 3, and that the third arrived at the exact moment when solutions were most needed. Watch it now, knowing what happens. And there is still a quality of inevitability about the third goal that is hard to explain. It does not feel shocking. It feels in a strange way, like the only possible ending, as though the match had always been going to finish that way, with that act. That quality of inevitability is the mark of something that has been compressed into a single moment, the entirety of what a player is, delivered without reservation at the exact second when everything is on the line. The 2002 World Cup in Korea and Japan was Rivaldo's other stage. And in many ways, it was his other statement, not the concentrated brilliance of 90 minutes in Barcelona, but sustained contribution across a month-long tournament that required not just individual quality, but the ability to function within a team, across different opponents, in the structure of a competition where a single bad result ends everything. Brazil came into that tournament carrying expectation. They were the 5-time world champions, and their roster in 2002 was recognized as carrying serious threat. Ronaldo had recovered from the prolonged absence caused by the health problems that had surrounded the 1998 final and the injuries that followed it. He came to the tournament looking for the form that had made him, before those years of interruption, almost universally regarded as the best footballer in the world. Ronaldinho was 22 and already recognizably different from everyone else on the pitch, a player whose relationship with space and time within a football match operated according to principles that seemed to belong to a different game. And Rivaldo, at 29, was the most experienced of the 3 attacking players. The one who had already won the Ballon d'Or. The one who had already shown, across several seasons at Barcelona and with the national team, what he was capable of producing at the highest level. The tournament itself confounded many expectations. France, the defending champions, were eliminated in the group stage, without scoring a single goal. Argentina went out early. The traditional order of European and South American dominance was interrupted by performances from Senegal, Turkey, and South Korea that suggested the competitive landscape of international football was shifting. In that context, Brazil's progression through the tournament felt almost like an anchor, a reminder that some things in the game remained as they were. But they did not coast. They had to work for their results. There is a match worth visiting here that sits slightly outside the loudest memories of that tournament. The group stage fixture between Brazil and Belgium, played in Kobe on June 17th, was a game Brazil needed to win to confirm their progression with something to spare. Belgium were not a passive opponent. They were organized, physically capable, and came into the match having offered more resistance than Brazil's reputation suggested they would face. The game was goalless at half-time. Brazil had created chances, but had not converted them, and the external commentary around the team carried a low hum of concern that Ronaldo had not yet fully found his rhythm, that the performance level was not yet matching the expectation. In the second half, Rivaldo scored. The goal was the result of a sequence that began with Brazil winning possession in midfield, moving the ball quickly forward, and Rivaldo arriving in the penalty area at exactly the moment the final pass found him. The finish was clean and certain. But what is interesting about that goal, watching it again, is not the moment of contact. It is the movement before the contact. The run that preceded it was not a straight sprint into the box. It was an angled, curved movement that took him across the face of the Belgian defence in a way that removed the nearest defender from the equation before the ball arrived. The goal was made in the 3 or 4 steps before the shot. The finish itself was almost automatic. He then contributed to the second goal. Brazil progressed. The match is not remembered as a classic, and Rivaldo's contribution to it is not cited regularly in discussions of great World Cup performances. It was a professional, high-quality contribution to a game that needed to be won. It did not have the theatrical structure of the Valencia hat-trick. It was, simply, very good football, played by someone who understood exactly what the situation required and provided it without excess. This is, in many ways, the most representative version of Rivaldo. Not the bicycle kick, which is real and extraordinary and deserves everything it has received, but the quieter match, the half-forgotten group stage game, where he read the situation, moved before the pass arrived, finished cleanly, and helped his team advance. That version of him repeated itself across 15 years of professional football, in competitions and matches that did not always have cameras trained on them, in performances that did not produce images that travelled around the world. Brazil beat England in the quarter-finals in a match where Ronaldinho's free kick, which sailed over goalkeeper David Seaman, became the defining image of that stage of the competition. They beat Turkey in the semi-finals, and in the final, against Germany, they won 2-0, with both goals scored by Ronaldo in the second half. Rivaldo was present throughout. His goals, his contributions in the build-up play, his work across the whole tournament, all of it was real and documented. The combination of him with Ronaldo and Ronaldinho gave Brazil an attacking variety that other national teams could not match. 3 different kinds of threat, 3 different ways of arriving in dangerous positions, 3 different languages of finishing that defenders had to try to accommodate simultaneously. And yet the story of that World Cup, in the way it has been told since, is Ronaldo's story. His presence, his goals in the final, the image of him with his arms raised in Yokohama, became the dominant memory. Ronaldinho's free kick against England became the viral moment. Rivaldo was there. He was significant. He was part of the reason Brazil won. But he was not the image. He was not the moment that endures most loudly. There is a particular experience in football, and perhaps in other fields, of being essential to a success that is remembered through other people, of contributing in ways that are real and large and documented, but that do not, in the retelling, carry your name at the center of the sentence. Rivaldo's entire career has a version of this quality. He was always there. He was almost always significant. But the sentence that summarizes the event tends to have someone else's name in the subject position. We should spend time with the specifics of his playing style, because understanding what he actually did, technically and tactically, helps explain both why he was so effective and why he is sometimes harder to describe than players with more immediately legible qualities. His most dangerous quality was his left foot. Not just its power, though the power was real. The ability to strike a ball cleanly from 30 meters and generate both the pace and the curve to beat a goalkeeper was something he possessed as fully as anyone in European football at the time. What made the left foot exceptional was its precision under pressure and its range of application. He could score from distance with a driven shot. He could bend a free kick around a wall and into the top corner. He could play a through ball with the outside of his left foot that arrived exactly where his teammate needed it and exactly the right pace. He could turn inside from a wide position and shoot across the goalkeeper with no backswing, no telegraphing, no readable preparation. The left foot contained multitudes. His positional movement was the quality that complicated attempts to categorize him. He occupied a zone between the number 10, the attacking midfielder, and the left winger, but none of these descriptions fits him cleanly. He was not a pure number 10 in the classical sense, sitting centrally behind the striker and linking everything through the middle of the pitch. He drifted wide, found himself in wider positions, created threat from angles that a central player would not have access to. He was not a traditional left winger because he was not interested in running past defenders repeatedly or delivering crosses from near the byline. He came inside, he found the half space between the left wing and the centre forward position, and he produced his threat from there. He was not exactly a second striker because he dropped deeper to receive the ball, drew defenders toward him, and then played past them rather than running beyond them. What he was, in the most accurate description, was a player organized around his left foot and his vision, who found the positions from which those two qualities could be most effectively applied, regardless of what name was given to those positions in the formation. This kind of positional freedom is a gift in practical terms. It makes a player almost impossible to mark tightly without sacrificing the defensive shape entirely. But it is a complication in terms of legacy, because legacy requires language, and the language of football positions is how we build the first sentence of a player's description. When you cannot say simply, "He was the greatest number 10," or "He was the greatest left winger," or "He was the greatest striker of his era," the description becomes longer and more qualified. And the longer and more qualified a description is, the harder it is to transmit across time. The players who survive most clearly in collective memory tend to be the ones whose position provides a container for their greatness. Rivaldo's greatness resisted the container. There is another dimension to consider, which is the era in which he played and the company he was keeping. The late 1990s and early 2000s produced, in a relatively compressed period, an unusual concentration of players who were genuinely extraordinary. Zidane was redefining what the attacking midfield position could be. Ronaldo, before his injuries, had been producing performances that people who saw them still describe as the most complete striking they ever witnessed. Thierry Henry at Arsenal was building a body of work that would eventually establish him as one of the greatest players in the history of the Premier League. Ronaldinho, in the years just after the 2002 World Cup, would produce a spell at Barcelona that many observers consider the most exciting football of the entire generation. The list of extraordinary players active in the same decade as Rivaldo is very long. In such company, the Ballon d'Or of 1999 is not a footnote, but it is one award among a sequence of awards that went to multiple different players, none of whom achieved the kind of uninterrupted multi-year dominance that makes the question of who was best feel settled. The era was competitive in a way that distributed recognition across many players. And in a distributed recognition landscape, individual legacies are harder to concentrate and maintain. Zidane, for comparison, had a different kind of visibility. He played at Juventus during a period of Italian dominance in European competition, and then at Real Madrid during the construction of the Galacticos era. A period of enormous media attention and enormous global interest in everything that club did. He was involved in World Cup success with France in 1998 in a tournament played in France, which meant he was present in a cultural event that went far beyond football. His backstory connected to questions of immigration and identity in a way that gave his career a social meaning beyond the game itself. And he was, throughout his career, consistently present for the kinds of engagements that produced the material of public memory. None of this diminishes what Zidane achieved. He was a genuinely exceptional player. What it does is illustrate how the conditions around a player's career, the clubs they play for, the tournaments they participate in, the personality they project, the cultural contexts that frame their achievements, shape how those achievements are ultimately held in memory. Rivaldo's conditions were less conducive to the building of maximum legacy. After leaving Barcelona, Rivaldo spent one season at AC Milan, where he won the Champions League in 2003. This is often forgotten, or at least not connected to his name, as automatically as it should be. The Milan squad that season was exceptional. They beat Juventus on penalties in the final in Manchester. A Champions League winner's medal. Another piece of the record, sitting quietly. After Milan, he moved to Olympiacos in Greece, where he won domestic titles but was no longer at the center of continental attention. Then to Cruzeiro in Brazil. Then to a series of later career moves that took him progressively further from the competitions where the football world's memory is most actively maintained. The late career years were professional. He continued to play, to score, to contribute, but he was no longer in the space where the record of his contributions would accumulate in the collective awareness of the game. The accumulation of the quieter version of him, the Belgium match, the Tuesday evening fixtures, the domestic cup rounds, is, in some ways, more impressive than the famous moments alone. Famous moments are, by definition, rare. They are the peaks. But a career is also built from everything that happens between the peaks. From the weeks when the body is tired, and the motivation requires active maintenance, and the football still has to be played. Rivaldo's record across those ordinary stretches, when you look at it properly, is the record of a player who was consistently close to the top of what the game could offer. Not occasionally, not only in the moments that became famous, consistently. That consistency tends to be taken for granted in the players who possess it. It is only noticed in its absence. During the period when Rivaldo was producing that reliable quality, it was noted by those paying attention. But it did not generate the kind of noise that intermittent brilliance generates, because consistent excellence, almost paradoxically, is easier to overlook than the sudden, concentrated kind. There is one more thing worth saying about the Barcelona years that is sometimes absent from the discussion of his legacy there. The relationship between Rivaldo and the club was not always harmonious in the administrative sense. There were periods of reported tension about his role and his positioning requirements. There were moments when the club appeared to consider moving him on, and when Rivaldo expressed frustration with what he perceived as a lack of clarity about his future at the club. None of this was particularly dramatic. There was no spectacular falling out, no open warfare of the kind that sometimes produces memorable stories. But it was present, and it meant that his departure from Barcelona did not have the quality of a celebrated farewell. It was the end of something that had been excellent and had then, gradually, become uncertain. Players who leave their most famous clubs under uncertain circumstances sometimes find that the uncertainty colours the retrospective view of the whole period, not because the football was less excellent, it was not, but because unclear endings make it harder to frame the preceding years in a fully celebratory light. Rivaldo's Barcelona chapter is extraordinary by any objective measure, but it ended in a way that left some unresolved tone. And that tone has perhaps contributed, in a small way, to the relative quietness of how it is remembered. All of this brings us, finally, to the question that has been present since the beginning of this reflection. Not just why we do not talk about Rivaldo enough, but what it would mean to talk about him properly, what it would require, and whether, in some important sense, his own relationship to his legacy makes the question almost paradoxical. Because here is the thing. Rivaldo, in everything that is documented about his approach to his career and his public presence, does not appear to have wanted the conversation. He did not position himself as a legend in waiting. He did not, in retirement, attach himself to the media structures that produce and maintain reputations in the football world. He did not become a pundit, a regular presence at events and broadcasts where former players reinforce their status in the public consciousness. He moved away from the center of attention in the way that people move when they are not comfortable in the center of attention. This is consistent with everything we know about how he was formed. The player whose development happened not in the spotlight, but in the quieter, harder spaces of northeastern Brazil. The player who at Barcelona was described by teammates as private and focused. The player who could vanish from a match for 40 minutes and return with a bicycle kick in the final seconds of added time, and seem, even in that extraordinary moment, not to be performing, but simply solving a problem. The person and the player were continuous with each other. What Rivaldo seemed to understand, or perhaps not understand in an explicit sense, but embody, was that football is not primarily about what others think of you. It is the act itself. The ball and the foot and the space and the decision. The goal that goes in or doesn't. The match that is won or lost. These things are complete in themselves. They do not require a surrounding narrative to justify their existence. They happened. They are real. The record contains them. For most players who reach his level, this is not quite enough. Not because they are shallow, but because they understand, consciously or instinctively, that the act of playing and the act of being remembered are two different activities and require different kinds of attention. Being remembered requires shaping the story. It requires giving the right interviews, maintaining the right relationships, being present in the right context, offering the right material to the people who build narratives for a living. Rivaldo never did these things, or did them insufficiently, or simply did not understand them as his responsibility. And so the gap exists between what he achieved, the Ballon d'Or, the World Cup, the Champions League, the La Liga titles, the extraordinary individual moments that include, but are not limited to the Valencia hat-trick, and how present he is in the everyday conversation about football greatness. There is something you could call beautiful about this, if you are inclined toward a certain kind of romanticism. A player who trusted the football to carry the meaning, who did not augment or amplify or position, who played and created and decided and then quietly went away. There is an integrity to that which is worth acknowledging. But there is also something we lose when the conversation does not happen. Because the conversation about Rivaldo, about what made him special, about the particular quality of his contribution, about the way he existed at Barcelona and in the 2002 World Cup, and in that Valencia match, is also a conversation about a specific kind of footballing intelligence that is worth understanding. The ability to wait, the ability to read a match from within it and know when the moment has arrived, the ability to produce under maximum pressure. Not one extraordinary act, but three, each different from the others, each exactly right. That intelligence is rare. It was rare when he possessed it. It remains rare. And because he is not in the conversation as actively as he might be, that specific quality is not as discussed, not as examined, not as fully understood as it deserves to be. He was not first in the queue for historical recognition. He was not the loudest voice in any room he occupied. He was, for the entirety of his career, exactly what the football required him to be and nothing else. And when the football required him to be everything, as it did on that June night in Barcelona, with the Champions League on the line and the clock running out, he was that completely. A bicycle kick from a corner in the 3rd minute of added time, with 80,000 people in the stadium, and a season's worth of consequence, riding on the result. Rivaldo did it, and then the match was over, and then he went home. He was not overlooked because he lacked greatness. He was overlooked because his greatness did not demand attention. He did everything. He decided games. He created moments that should have lasted forever. And yet, he never insisted on being remembered. Maybe that is why. Good night.